things that were hiding in plain sight for a long time have suddenly been brought into the spotlight. All the kind of inequality and equity, the poorest and the most vulnerable, the elderly, the criminalized, particularly people of color.
People who need to work and can't just stay home.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's sort of like, yeah.
And they've been sacrificed. They're simultaneously, this is an unbelievable sort of irony that they're called our essential workers, and yet they're so expendable, apparently.
Right.
It's just that, and I think one of the problems has been that in order to kind of engage in this discourse properly, I think they've had to face up to so many ideological problems, with sort of neoliberalism and market-oriented capitalism and financialized capitalism. It's like, the solutions are to be found in a much more kind of socialist thinking. The only game in town to actually deal with problems
and
is
these are problems that markets have not solved.
Exactly.
There's a whole pretense, that market solutions work for everyone, but many people know that that's not true, and now it seems that more people know that that's not true. I don't know whether it will result in people. I mean, it seems as though there are trends towards people thinking about more socialist and socially oriented solutions, but we'll see. It's such a weird fantasy space that people wish to believe things that just aren't true, like about housing or about healthcare or about education. At least in this country, it's sort of like there are all these fictions about, how to ameliorate these, differences and changes, but it seems as though the systemics are kind of always point to disaster. And yet, at least here, you mentioned the word socialism, and it's like, it's a scary word, and people feel as though their freedoms will be compromised, and their, notions of themselves and the society they live in will become debased and destroyed and eroded. And it's sort of like, well, what is this going on right now? It's sort of like, are you saying that this is the solution? It's as though this is the problem. It's like,
I mean, again, I think this is sort of what's been so amazing about looking at this current sort of body of work that I can imagine and know is going to be appearing in public in Piccadilly Circus, great gathering place in London. It's like, it's somehow about capturing or recapturing the imagination. The right, or the centre right, or the right, or however you want to put it, have had a monopoly on the imagination for so long. Idea they can actually so powerfully kind of tell people that turning left is wrong, socialism is like a dirty word, and it's going to be, all these things. The idea that part of the battle has to be to work out how to effectively recapture the imagination and say, no, this is not a frightening thing, this is a solution, and like, here's our opportunity to see it and evidence it. I think the UK and the United States are in a similar situation, I think.
Not dissimilar. And the weird, like, I don't know, perverse captivity of these right-wing sort of notions. It's like, but this makes no sense, for most people. But there's this kind of imaginary that seems to function where, it's even, at a kind of micro level, Trump as a kind of personality or idiom, or as some have said, a cult. It's kind of like, well, what is this based on? He's not a great businessman. He played one on television, but that's reality television. That's not reality. It's kind of like, he won't, he's got money. He won't cheat me. And it's sort of like, but there are all these cases of him being sued by people who work for him, and yet there's this this mythology of his, business acumen and the deals he can cut. And it's sort of like, well, what deals are those? I mean, he seems to have alienated all our allies in pursuit of, this deal that seems, like pie in the sky in the worst possible sense. It's sort of like, is this really a deal? Is this really working, for the nation, and it's like, well, everybody knows that we're winners, and it's sort of like, dude, this is not, this is not work. This is not going to work. We'll become tired of winning. Somebody sent out of a social media post, and it's sort of like, "Are you tired yet?" And it's
Yeah.
sort of like, "Yeah, because I don't see any winning around here." It's sort of like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Totally. It's just bizarre. I think, I suppose not quite to the same degree, but it's always surprising to kind of catch a glimmer of people's, love of, or kind of enthrallment to people like Boris Johnson and the
Yeah.
government. It's like, he's not a celebrity, in the same way that Trump was, but he's kind of, he's got a very, very, very strong and hard won kind of reputation in TV and media and journalism
Mhm.
for being a kind of a lovable, kind of funny, guy with a bit of gumption that people sort of really respond to and enjoy and like. And you can't seem to fail enough for people to turn around and say, okay, time's up.
This is a fail. This is not, it's so, I guess, so easily turned around, into some sort of fiction about how the system is dysfunctional and cannot, really hear the truth that is being brought by these figures. How can you be, president of the United States for 4 years and still, wish to perform yourself as an outsider and, as someone who's been victimized and compromised by this evil system, this cabal of, pedophiles. And, it's like weird. It's almost like they'd rather believe that than actually see the failures. I can't, it's sort of like hope springs infernal or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the strange thing, the idea that there are kind of plain problems that you can point to and articulate and say this is the problem, and yet everybody seems to want to point the finger at other things, conspiracy theories or migration or
Right. Exactly.
like
always something else.
yeah,
Not what we are doing, where we are. It's always, people from outside,
exactly.
immigrants, potential immigrants. It's sort of like, and again, it's almost like, well, it seems like small businesses started by immigrants are one of the engines of these economies, and yet they become sort of the boogie person, in this kind of fiction. It's like, well, I just don't understand it, it's almost as though the sort of large scale and systemic failures are kind of scapegoated onto others.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think, I mean, in a way, this comes very neatly into the work, I think, and sort of some of the observations I've made over the weekend about them. But
Mm.
it's, I guess part of that is that in this attempt to capture the imagination, it's like, looking at systemic problems with, structures of capitalism, perhaps, or kind of, the way in which these things work. It's a very, very difficult narrative to kind of articulate and capture and explain and say, look, the problem, the pain and the problems you're experiencing are a direct result of inequalities within the way, capital's distributed and money's made and businesses are privileged over these things. That's a really hard thing to kind of galvanize people around. So it's much easier for the right, who are kind of complicit in that and the cause of those things, to say, no, it's not that. That's very complicated. What's easy is, look, the migrants are coming in and taking your jobs, and this is happening. And conspiracy theories do
Violence
the
and
same
crime.
role. Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually what they've become very, very good at is sort of streamlining that messaging to such an extent that it's just capturable. It gives us the tools to, or gives people the tools to sort of speak up and speak out and take a position that's been predetermined by them, given to them to use, to share, and say, migration is the problem, and that's why I stand on this side of the fence. Whereas actually to sort of think through, robustly and conjunctly through complexity and problems and real complexity is a very difficult thing to ask people to do or enable people to do. And I think, this almost comes to the first question I posed to you about the first work. It seems that your work's often, if you like to paraphrase Donna Haraway, sort of, want to stay with the trouble. The idea that your works actually actively sort of participate in this complexity, or sort of highlight the complexity of messaging. It's got this visually streamed kind of thing. It's like, okay, I understand the idea that this information being given to me, but it's not didactic. It's not straightforward. It's not polemical.
Not straightforward in that way. Yeah, because in a certain sense, I think, there's the, how should I put it? I guess I recognize on some level that it's difficult to message that in a kind of succinct way. And as you say, it seems the right has a kind of franchise on that. And I'm hoping, to some extent through my work to engage, the imagination and produce questions rather than, quote unquote, tell people, what they should believe or what they need to know. I mean, I think obviously I choose certain things for particular reasons, but I think the address is maybe a little more complicated and a little maybe more diffuse than kind of direct statements about or trying to explain, because it's difficult at the very on even a surface level to do that. I thought, in response to your comments, I did have, I had comments, and maybe we can go through maybe section by section or paragraph by paragraph.
Yeah,
that might be helpful.
That'd be fantastic.
I think in section 1, I love, your introduction to, and your reading of the piece. And what I had to say was that initially I was thinking about this idea throughout the series, actually, of this kind of first words and last words. And the first words, of course, being kind of the title and the actual opening of Blyden's book, which I found really interesting. And it's sort of connected to a question that I had been asked actually by someone, a young woman who I think may have been a student. I gave a talk at the Whitworth Gallery in Manchester last year, early, I can't remember, maybe February. And she asked about the place of anger in my work, in that I guess she had detected that maybe from the topics or maybe from the actual, let's say, text or music material that I recruited, that there was a kind of underlying deployment, or thinking about what anger can and could do in a practice, right? Maybe as a trigger.
Yeah.
And that actually led me to think specifically in that first part of the series about the ways in which punk has been recuperated and, may I say, misused by so-called disrupting, figures on the right, whether they be Brexiteers or those Trumpians like Steve Bannon, who redeploy kind of extreme and punkish attitudes and poses in public, but they do so in the name of a hyper-capitalist, hyper-macho, hyper-conservatism. And it's, in some of the later works, I kind of contrast maybe that with, you could say powerful last words, both the Elijah McClain and the John Lewis. But, there's a way in which, though last, you could argue in one way, they are far from last in a sense, because those words, I hope can, trigger readers and viewers to consider the afterlives of these events and struggles that they're trying to represent in different ways. And again, I sort of thought through that maybe the echoes and deep mournings around, those incidents that they're narrating are kind of related in a certain way to the subjects of Judith Butler's text in the series, which is the last thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, those were just kind of my reactions.
Yeah, I it's fascinating. I think, the more time I spent with these texts, that the more you these works, but the more you realize how related they are to each other as well. There's such a complex kind of myriad set of things happening, not only within the individual pieces, but they speak to one another, and they obviously move through in quite a linear way. I think that was quite clear too, from the individual to the collective to the emotive to the infrastructural, and the way that you sort of say that the final ones also addresses the first one, and this idea of last first, and I mean that really comes through. And I think this idea of how that kind of transgressive or kind of punk spirit has been kind of become an effective tool to kind of galvanize the wrong thing is really fascinating. It's almost a little bit like CIA's rebranding at the moment. You know, it looks like a new kind of practice-based research course at a British arts institution or so. You know, it's kind of, it's like, and it's like, you know, it's a recruitment drive for the CIA, and it's like, it's, you know, these kind of, you know, it's like these techniques and cultural bursts of brilliance are recognized and cherry-picked for their kind of emotive or effective charge to do the wrong thing. And I think, you know, your work seems to be reclaiming that and complexifying that and saying, you know, well, let's bring it back into a kind of a more open context, a stranger context or something.
Yeah, or try to, you know, it's sort of like this idea that, you know, all, you know, positions have been captured. I mean, the other thing that I've been thinking about for a fairly long time in my work is this idea of like right-wing capturing of populism as a kind of discursive. And how did that happen? And what allows it to continue? And you could maybe see threads of that also in the re-encoding, if you will, of a kind of a punk ethos in that, yes, we're angry. Yes, we're aware, you know, of class difference, but it's kind of focused on, say, white males, as opposed to the diversity of people who may be in difficult circumstances. And that's very strange. It's almost the way in which, you know, Trump is always at great pains to paint himself as a victim of the media or of, you know, the establishment, when he's one of the most privileged characters I can think of. And this idea that, you know, he is somehow the victim of the system is, you know, a kind of, you know, reversal and perversion of what may actually be the case. But he gets to kind of adopt those populist forms and positions himself in that way, when it's sort of, well, how does that work, you know, or what, you know? And, you know, he's not alone, of course. I mean, I think historically about a figure like Ronald Reagan and how he was also able to capture and galvanize, you know, angers, displacements, disappointments, especially among white working class people, and kind of position, you know, America as the bulwark of freedoms and all these other things, while basically doing a great job for the upper classes. But the rhetoric, you know, has, you know, all these appeals, if you will, to working class people who feel so quote unquote marginalized in their own country or something like that. And it's sort of like, well, it's more complicated, and it's interesting that this is effective because it's, you know, kind of a very kind of thin fiction, but, you know, reinforced through repetition. And I think that was probably something too, you know, that is historical. I mean, I think the Bush administrations were masters, especially George W., masters at repeating a lie, you know, and now it's even more overblown. You know, at first it was things like weapons of mass destruction or, you know, crime and its trajectory through society. And now it's kind of like everything is contested.
Yeah.
You know, the elections are contested, the status of the media and truth are contested. And, you know, instead of it being kind of like a grudging admission, as it may have been, say, a decade or two ago, now it's sort of like completely upfront. You know, what is it? Facts, you know, sort of personal and individual facts. You have your facts and I have mine.
Yeah. It's bizarre. I mean, it's kind of, I think, I want to be careful how I sort of phrase this, but in some senses, you know, culturally and historically, it would be quite easy to sort of remember Trump as like a really, really interesting moment for language in the public realm, you know, because he's sort of almost mastered, or his kind of the people around him and him have mastered a kind of a magical sort of, and I mean magic in a very sort of occultish kind of, you know, it's absolutely fascinating that the idea that what Trump seems to have been able to do, which for the first time, as far as I'm aware, you know, compared to George W. Bush and other people, he can say one thing on a Monday and it can be recorded, televised, documented, transcribed. But on the Tuesday, say he never said that. And just as long as he keeps saying, I never said that, or I said it differently, I said it like this. Or he could even, and then on a Wednesday say, well, okay, I did say that, but it was a lie, and now I'm telling the truth. You know, these kind of things. You know, what that does is not only does it sort of, and he uses all the apparatus possible of like the alt-right and, you know, kind of strange sort of murky things happening in the background that, you know, kind of really consolidate this thinking and these views within a community of supporters, and this sort of cultish devotion suddenly really energizes these things. But what it also does, which I think is the most important bit, is this allows journalists to do their job, because journalists historically, their job has been to sort of find out and uncover lies and ascertain truths and fictions. But Donald Trump's already saying, yeah, well, that was a lie. I did lie. So what? Now I'm telling you this. And it's like, so journalists are left with like, well, hang on, what's my job then? If I can't even take any kind of command of this situation at all, because it's almost like a magical way of operating, which completely confuses everything up. Yeah.
I did say that, but I meant this.
Yeah.
Or, you know, it's kind of like, but you said that. It's almost like, well, yes, I did say it, but, you know, it's sort of like what I meant was, or that wasn't, you know, to say something, you know, that is, you know, on its surface racist, and say, no, it's not racist. I'm American, and we need to maintain our borders. You know, these untruths say that I'm telling about Mexicans. He's a Mexican. You know, it's almost like too that status and that definition then kind of carries with it all these affects. And the question is, does it? You know, it's sort of like, does that explain anything? You know, it's like, or if it does explain something, it's, you know, something, you know, that some people can dismiss because they know on a certain level that it's untrue, and other people can embrace because it is their imaginary, you know. So it's weird in that way, you know, that some people kind of turn it off and pay no attention to it, and other people see it as, you know, a kind of truthful signal, but it's not. You know, it's neither of those.
Yeah. I mean, a very good example of that is when, you know, his insistence on calling coronavirus the Chinese virus. You know, it's you know, this is outright racist. When it's called out for being racist in the press room, he says, it came from China, didn't it?
Right.
And then suddenly the fact is easier to sort of, you know, identify with his supporters. It's not racist, he's just saying it came from China, and that's a fact. But, you know, the characterization of that is deeply racist, and everyone knows it. But, you know, it's easier to explain it as a fact than it is as within the discourse and long history of racism and how it's deployed. Right. It's kind of,
you kind of have to take a long detour through, you know, histories of language and representation in order to locate, you know, that in a kind of specific way. I mean, some people are willing to kind of take it, quote unquote, at face value, and say that it is, you know, it's just a fact. Why are you over-interpreting these things? You know, why? You know, again, it gets into, you know, questions of policing language, and you know, the great bugaboo of what is it, political correctness, you know, that kind of, it's like, well, don't police my language, you know what I mean. It's kind of
But this is also the great strength, you know, or the thing that's been recognized by the right and by Trump particularly, that you know, that this has become their tool. They're kind of excellent at sort of relying on that kind of discourse as the first step, you know, saying, oh, you know, this is encroaching on our freedom of speech, and why can't I say that? And I didn't mean that.
Why can't I say that? Right, that's true. Why can't I say it? What's the problem?
Yeah, exactly.
It's sort of like, well, there are many problems, but the thing is, you want to short circuit the problems by, you know, identifying a scapegoat, for instance. It's kind of like, and that's, that is hard, I think, to call out properly. Because he always has this fallback position that, oh, it's just something I said. I didn't mean that. I meant something else. Or, you know, you're being too careful with language. You know, that's part of the problem. We can't call things what they really are. And it's sort of like, no, the problem is that you are lying over and over again.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like they've claimed a monopoly over some weird logic, you know, function. You know, it's kind of I don't know, it is. But I mean, just to sort of talk about the point of his privilege as well, I think this is something that's very interesting in this conflation of, or people reaching for the simplest kind of thing rather than actually investing in time to analyze properly for themselves, is the idea that, you know, because Twitter, for example, as one platform, banned him from using their platform, this has become a huge thing about saying, oh, why have corporations got the right to censor? This is a good point, but like,
yeah,
but it's not a point related specifically to Trump's freedom of speech, because let's not forget, Trump has still, while he's president, got a press room. He's probably got the most availability to freedom of public speech still of any human being on the planet.
which
Not been censored. It's
yeah.
like if you're thrown out of a bar for fighting, doesn't mean you've been censored from drinking forever. It just means you can't go to that bar. Don't forget, this is a corporate platform with rules. And if the rules are broken, anyone could be thrown off. Your freedoms of speech have not been censored. You've been thrown out of a corporation. I mean, it's
also goes to another platform, and he has, or his whatever. But yes, nothing at the same scale as Twitter. I get that, but yeah, he doesn't have a kind of untrammeled right again to say whatever he wants in this corporate space, really.
Totally.
So yeah, you get into weird like conundrum around free speech rights versus, but you're in a kind of setting that actually has rules, and you're flouting those rules, with your freedom of speech. So it's a little gnarly, and I think it's a lot easier again to scan that and say his rights have been abridged, and not think about the context perhaps in which that so-called abridgment takes place. I mean, I think it's not dissimilar to those claims made around wearing a mask. It's like my rights to free expression and to deal with my life as it were for myself have been abridged. And it's sort of like, but you live in a society with other people, and there are restrictions on those freedoms that we deal with every day. And if we choose to avoid them, it is at not only our own peril, but the peril of society to, take that, attitude. And again, somehow it seems much easier for certain people to just see it as an abridgment and not see the sort of connectivity. And maybe that's, a kind of hyper individualism or hyper machoism or something like that.
Yeah.
And, it has deadly consequences in that case, and also in the case of the relationship that Americans seem to have with guns. I can't imagine how should I put it? It would seem to produce more problems for me if I wanted to go everywhere with a gun. It's just sort of, but for other people it seems just part of their freedom. And so it's like, well, there are these disequilibria that I don't know, people don't want to acknowledge.
Well, I mean, freedom from speech isn't without freedom from consequences. This is sort of, there are always limits to freedoms of speech. It's like I can't go up to a police person and say I'm going to kill you, because I'll either be arrested or shot myself. That's a limit to freedom of speech, and I know that, so I exercise that. I walk up to the limit and I recognize the limit. And suddenly when people hear things that they don't want to, or kind of, or are told they can't say certain things, they think that's just an outright blanket, quashing of their freedoms of speech. It's like, no, well, it might be, but there's always freedom. There's no freedom of consequence to something you say.
Again, that's not what I meant. Is an attempt to get a free pass to any consequence, and it's precisely that kind of almost literal in some cases, lack of responsibility to others, which is kind of the motor behind the lies in a certain way. I'm not responsible for any of this, so I can say what I want and then change my mind or say something else, or because I'm not responsible, in a kind of basic way. And I don't know why that doesn't read as kind of the ultimate in privilege, because that's kind of what it is. I say one thing, I do another, I say one thing, then I say something else. And that was, a technique, again, he's not the first one to tap into it. I still remember the article in the New York Times Magazine. I can't remember who the journalist was, but basically, George W. is quoted as saying, one of his minions is quoted as saying something to the effect of, when we speak, we define reality. And, you can examine that and question that and, contextualize that. and then we'll speak again and create another new reality. This kind of idea that we can just, through rhetoric, define the world. And that you can study it, you can question it, but you can't stop us from making reality when we speak. Yeah. And that's kind of like, well, that's an interesting belief, but it sort of has consequences again.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I think the idea of rhetoric is really interesting. I mean,
yeah,
I've often, in my own sort of research and work that I do, around writing around language and things, I've tried to sort of frame the idea of rhetoric in opposition to, or if rhetoric is like a performative, it's kind of constitutive of an outcome, or the speaker who uses rhetoric is able to thrust into the world an idea that it becomes, this world building that you've just characterized and described. But, and I often sort of look to things that you could position as maybe the opposite of rhetoric, that create these open spaces or these kind of fields of danger that I think Poe kind of coined the term in relation to sort of parrhesia or parrhesiatic kind of speech, where in order to kind of be the opposite of a rhetorical thing or a performative, you have to engender a space where total openness for both the speaker and the listener is made, so that discourse is knowable, outcomes are unknowable, and that's where you set some sense of the idea of truth, which is not rhetoric actually, which is truth emerging from a context and a situation that's made by the speaker and the listener. And I'm fascinated by this. This is what Parrhesia is about, and the project that I've been working on with artists in this respect. But I think that's happening so much in your work, because I think somehow your work places such a demand on viewers, and I mean that in a complimentary sense. I think that's a good thing. The viewer, the listener, is required to kind of listen to multiple speakers, multiple contexts, draw on their own understanding or kind of knowledge of those contexts or not, and essentially build something out of the situation that's emerging from the work. So this is almost opposite of rhetorical. It's opposite of polemic. It's opposite of the performative. You're not building a world for us to kind of understand. You're creating a landscape for us to inhabit and build something within ourselves. And I think this is the amazing thing about the complexity of your work. And I just think that idea of rhetoric is very interesting, actually.
Yeah, it's almost it's something that I'm interested in too. But I don't want to, how should I put it? I want to maybe put it a little bit under pressure, by recontextualizing that material.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, well, this is a construct, and it had, maybe a specific moment and a specific history, but it could have different relationships and different, modes of address, ways of reading. And to some extent, I think, by destabilizing certain, common sort of alleged knowledges, that you can, I think, get to an effect that opens up the text, or it makes you actually, often I feel that, I massively quote, someone or something, but I like to do so kind of without certain of the contextualizing anchors, just so that we can, maybe read the language. And, sometimes people say, well, I can hear the voice of the speaker. I know exactly, who's saying it. But other times, there's a kind of uncertainty, just because, is this Tony Koch saying this? Who's saying this exactly?
Yeah.
Can produce a kind of provocative, differential relationship with that material. It's like, is this something that is generalizable, is performable in a certain way? And if it is, then maybe you can ask some questions about, how it's constituted, how it's, composed, and its effects. I hope that is true. In a certain way, I would say that's my hope and my wager. But of course, I'm, suspicious about it, especially, in these dark times. And yeah, I think, there's a part of me that probably believes that, hopelessness is as futile as false hope. And so I hope that by kind of presenting a different context for these, what at first may seem to be closed, cases or closed utterances, that it might be possible to both address and contest the sort of habitual, forms that we encounter, whether it be advertising or political rhetoric. And it's I think in this set of pieces, I'm trying to maybe do something a little different, and that is, it's almost like a kind of again, a recontextualization of the remit of doing a public project. It's something that I think my work has been moving towards for a very long time. And strangely enough, when I, get there, at least in a kind of intentioned or commission kind of context, my almost immediate gesture was to code much of the material. And I thought about that a little bit. In some ways, I think in response to your responses. And, I think one of the ideas that's kind of been running in the back of my mind is that if you're going to say something in public, you might want to collapse or complicate the reading in a certain way, in a different way than you would if it were maybe in a more closed environment, or where you were looking specifically at one thing or addressing a quote unquote known audience. It sort of appealed to me, the possibility that it would be something that might be interpretable, but maybe not interpretable in the same way as other, my previous work might be. It was like I've been using these coding systems like for titles of things, but not, so much in the pieces themselves. And I thought, what if I, kind of reverse that relationship? And I was also thinking about your comments and maybe questions around authorship. And I want to, in a certain way, to relinquish, certain expectations with regard to authorship to readers. And, there's a kind of, I think, a literary, tradition, if you will, works like William Burroughs' work with quotations, or somebody like the British author.
Sorry, I was thinking of someone else. I was thinking like maybe Kathy Acker as well.
Kathy Acker, certainly. That was the third name that I was going to give. I guess the other is, oh my God, the atrocity, J.G. Ballard.
Yeah, Ballard, yeah.
And, but of course, I'm not really using literature as such. I'm using journalism theory and political, rhetoric. But it's kind of that, it's a kind of, I think it introduces a certain both imaginative and differential, maybe historical and locational relationship to a text, to just, suspend it in a different sort of space and place. And I began to think, well, maybe that should change the way the text is presented in, in the case of these works. I think, maybe too, those imaginative, readings, I'd even call them sometimes misreadings, desiring readings, minor readings, destabilizing readings, are very productive. And, I noted the quote that you used, and I in talking about that, and I was really struck by, the ways in which they can queer, tweak, and hack, the so-called authority of a given text. And that certainly comports with my belief, for instance, even about, Blackness, that it too could be a hack, a mocking, ghostly technology or othering of meaning, and generating, sort of difference and potentials, as opposed to being, something that is closed, has an essence, it when you see it, and those kinds of tropes, which, of course, are precisely the kinds of things that are at stake in, the anti-immigrant or the racist and both speech, thoughts, and acts that we see so much today.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I kind of, lucky in a sense that I just finished that book. It came from Kathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings, and that phrase just struck me as like something I'd never considered before. You know, the idea of the kind of a migrant language, or someone who kind of had grown up to some extent ashamed of not being able to speak, you know, kind of good English, but then later in life wearing it as like a badge, or kind of you know, like a rallying cry, I think she calls it. You know, the idea that actually, no, this is something we have to hold on to. This is the battlefield of these oppressions. You know, kind of language. You know, this is where it takes place. So let's kind of use the language we've got to deliberately kind of undermine, hack, queer. You know, and that, you know, it just really struck me. And then sort of course, when I saw your work, and here I am confronted with not only just being given information in some didactic sense, but it's been further sort of abstracted and taken away from this level of just clear communication, where I have to do some work. I have to kind of invest more in this sort of this proposition. Suddenly made me think, this is the sort of similar demand that's being placed on me. This is fascinating, you know. I thought that was incredibly interesting. But yeah, I also wonder, I mean, I know we're sort of jumping around a bit, but to kind of focus again on the second question about, and we have talked about this, but you know, the idea that this is going to be in public is you know, not in a museum, for example. I know we have talked about this, but I thought this was really important. I suppose just a simpler question would be, you know, were these works, or this kind of set of works or suite of works, kind of deliberately and specifically designed with the idea that this would be in such a public space?
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking, what could one do in a public, you know, context like that, and where, you know, maybe there are certain expectations and desires that people expect with regard to the use of language and messaging, and if there would be, you know, even simple ways to complicate, you know, that, and to maybe cause a certain kind of thinking again about what it is that we are seeing and what it is that we expect to see. I think, I was kind of drawn also to that idea of, you know, and this was something actually you touched on in the thing that you were saying just now, that, you know, to appear in public, you would assume that one would take a certain positionality and a certain phraseology and address in language to be clear, etc. But what if you took that opportunity to I don't know, to send something more complicated, or something that indicated your maybe complicated status with regard to plain speaking.
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of like, well, I've been given the opportunity to do this, but on the other hand, you know, it's also kind of complicated. You know, it's something that I could do very easily, but it is kind of in that way like, you know, the kinds of presentations of self that, you know, constantly go on in public. And I think you noted that also, that, you know, that there is always a kind of coding and a kind of production going on, even when one, you know, says, I'm going to do this in the clearest and most expedient way possible. That is only maybe a part of, say, someone's subjectivity and knowledges. And it seemed interesting to me to kind of take the scale as a kind of, you know, I don't know, test of legibility. But what if it presented or comported itself, you know, somewhat differently? And it also kind of underlines something that in my notes, I think I talked about later with regard to the Judith Butler text, seemed not to work in that case. Because it was more like unintelligible in many passages, and would require multiple, you know, sort of scanning through to even come up with, say, half of the material in the text. Whereas some of the other, go ahead.
So it's actually almost a formal thing in that respect. There is that the work just simply didn't quite scan as well.
It was almost like, I mean, obviously for some people, I think it would be appealing because it would be almost even more fragmented, more poetic, more suggestive or evocative. You kind of need more imagination and more investment of time
Mm.
in order to decode it. And there was again, maybe I'm thinking about it in dynamic terms. It was almost like, well, maybe that's too much of a requirement.
Yeah.
And maybe that then is a reason to turn to the specificities of the language, that she is using and the issues which she wishes to underline. And because it, is a very short part of a longer interview, I felt like maybe, it's a moment to, I don't know, think about more complex ideas in more complex languages requiring maybe a different mode of address.
Mm.
And then, thinking also that in terms of the limited time, that in order to communicate something, it might be better to try to do so in a more kind of exact translation. Whereas where other things, it was interesting. It was like these texts are relatively plain, and yet they have their resonances. But it maybe becomes more interesting and useful to kind of say this is not just a copy of something that exists, but there's been some kind of mode of intervention applied to them. And so and it's interesting because, like I said, I've used this kind of coding technique for titles of pieces, but never for an entire piece that's devoted to this thing that's coded. And it gets me to some extent back to those questions of identity and being understood and being located by one's language. And as a gesture, it also seemed to be a kind of strategic, it was almost like, I don't think I would do this if I thought that it would circulate through usual means.
Yeah.
It was something about, the scale of it and the fact that, yes, okay, this would be before and after other things. And so, what differences might be constitutive in some way, as opposed to, I just want to enter the flow and kind of blend into it. And again, maybe it is, maybe possible to read it as a kind of formalist gesture. And form is interesting to me, but for me, one of my highest compliments I think I was ever paid by a student was, it's like, this is crazy, but it's always about something. And so if you lose the about something aspect of it, I feel like there's a kind of, principle loss in a way, or loss of an opportunity.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, but this is something I read about your work as well. It's sort of somebody, I can't remember who, I'm sorry, I should have made a note, but I read it recently. Someone saying that you've always in a tradition of maybe art and language or Jenny Holzer, these sorts of people have kind of treated text as visual in many respects, but it's like an effective sort of visuality that doesn't necessarily just point to a thing or a subject, but points to the discourse itself that sort of scaffolds that subject. So this kind of curious relationship between image and text, which is not about saying, oh, I'm going to make this so graphic and communicative visually that it speaks directly to a thing. It's going to speak around it all. Yeah, very interesting. I mean, it's really, really. I mean, I can just, when I was watching these films, I can just see them in Piccadilly Circus, and I thought, one of the interesting things for me as well about this kind of coding aspect, or this sort of abstraction or breaking down of the languages, as much as everything we've talked about, is also the kind of the amount of work it requires the visitor to do. And I think that's that's interesting, the space of like a public square where everybody's used to seeing advertising, which is sort of almost subliminally and subconsciously just like entered into the brain with this, expedited perfectly as information. And this actually sort of calls you to attention and says, actually, if I don't pay attention, I won't get it. So what is it? So it's kind of, you can imagine almost that a public that's usually just receiving these kind of advertising rays, suddenly actually turning their head and reading and becoming absorbed. And this is a really curious way to sort of constitute a public around an artwork, because, you know, one of the things I've also often tried to write about is this sort of weird paradox. It's not maybe a paradox, but I've called it a paradox of the museum, where, you know, art has historically been tasked or has chosen to sort of level its critique at certain forms of hegemony and problems, and be critical of certain situations and problems, like, you know, racism or inequality, and you know, problems with capitalism. But you know, our art institutions are simultaneously our very best institutions to voice our dissent. You know, you can't do it in many other institutions. But the paradox is, by doing it there, you're also reifying and upholding the problems the art itself is intending to critique. You know, sort of, you're doing it in a space where there's unfair labor, unpaid labor, inequalities, you know, managerial levels, you know, and all these things. So you're kind of voicing critique and leveling your critique at these things and voicing your dissent in a space that allows you to also reify and hold up these problems. So actually, in a public space where you're commandeering advertising and commandeering all that infrastructure that's usually the problem for this space, where you're making a public kind of just pay attention, is fascinating, you know. And it's a very specific context, I think, which that kind of coding of language has done an incredibly powerful job, I would say.
Thank you, because, you know, that's obviously what I'm going for. I think you, in many ways, you know, kind of hit the nail on the head with regard to the kinds of things I'm trying to, you know, work through and think through. Those problems, you know, there's even leakage on the other side, where, and this is something, you know, some people, it's not really directly related to my work, but it's something that I do think about, like the question of, there's some cultural information that you could argue has a radically different reading because, you know, there's a certain, I don't know, claim or expectation around its status. And therefore, by showing it in a museum, you get to see it in a radically different way than you would normally see it. I remember at one point in the early 90s having a kind of running argument with some friends and colleagues about what it meant to present the Rodney King beating tape in a Whitney biennial. And it was kind of amazing. There were some people who felt that, you know, well, this is kind of an insult to people who are doing socially engaged practices, because this is, you know, a quote unquote artifact or something accidental. And, you know, it's sort of like, well, my argument was always, maybe you should depressurize it then. Maybe it should be something you were able to look at in a museum and think about how you look differently, and, you know, what your desires and expectations are of that artifact in this particular context. And that's not to, you know, obviate any of the things you say about the inequalities that are manifest within the institution, because they are there. But it's interesting that it provides a kind of differential opportunity to look at something and to listen to something. Like, the first thing I realized was that I'd never seen the entire thing. I didn't know it had a soundtrack. And it was kind of like this weird kind of thing. It's like, oh yeah, this thing which is constantly being referred to as evidence of an argument that's being made verbally by a newscaster. It's almost like the realization that I'd only seen bits and pieces of it as a kind of, you know, position illustration in, you know, a particular form of packaging. And that idea that, oh, it actually has other potential existences, uses and meanings was kind of a revelation for me. You know, whether it's art or not, it's sort of like, please, I don't care. You know, it's sort of like, I don't feel compromised, you know, by its presentation. Quite the opposite in a certain way, because it's sort of like, hey, I've actually seen something here that I have not seen elsewhere. You know, it's sort of like, it doesn't matter whether it's art or not.
Yeah.
I could care less. Yeah.
And was it? I mean, what was that? Someone's work that was included in the Whitney Biennale? Was it?
Yeah, it was attributed to this guy. His name was George Halliday, I think, or Halliday. And basically what he did was he observed this encounter happening and he took out his camcorder and recorded it.
So it's literally the original footage. It's
the original footage with original sound.
Wow.
At full duration. And it was sort of like, oh, wow, doesn't have to be art. It's just a condition for looking at and hearing something. It was sort of like, it was kind of bizarre, you know. It was sort of like, I'm not really interested in whether an argument, you know, kind of the curator thumbing their nose at the intentions of artists or something like that, which is, I think, how some of my friends and colleagues viewed it.
Yeah.
You know, this thing is being presented as a kind of model, you know, for art, when I'm working very hard to maybe intervene in similar, you know, social situations and discourses. And I sort of get that argument, but it's sort of like, it's a context for viewing.
Yeah.
And you may learn some things about your so-called knowledges of this artifact from seeing it in a different space, period.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
No claims need to be made. But yeah, it's sort of like, again, it's a sort of exercise in maybe getting people to pay attention and to realize the limitations of maybe their knowledge and encounter, you know, with this information.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's useful and interesting also to kind of think about the context in which, you know, the envelope or the container in which, you know, something is presented, and you know, what the effects of that might be.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons why, you know, it's kind of like I'd been thinking about it, and occasionally things did show up in public contexts, you know, on a, you know, not initiated by me, but, you know, thinking about, okay, what would happen if that did happen? And obviously there are other people, Barbara Kruger, you know, Jenny Holzer, who were presenting their work in public. And so it was kind of like also, you know, as someone who has on occasion been accused of using similar techniques to the detriment of my own work, I thought, well, what can I do that would be specific, you know, because I know, you know, something at least about those histories and gestures. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because I didn't know that. And although formally and kind of strategically very different to your work, but this idea of, I remember actually as an artist called a British artist called Ryan Gander, who once had a show at Tate, and he was given this opportunity that, you know, emerging artists are given at Tate Britain called Art Now. And it's really, you know, it's a signal that an artist is coming to a certain phase in their career, and it's a showcase, really.
Yeah, sure.
And what Ryan Gander chose to do was sort of show random works from Tate's holdings and collections alongside just a seemingly random selection of much, much younger artists' work. And so there was nothing of Ryan Gander, the artist, in his showcase. And so in this sort of accompanying kind of press text and interview, he said that a curious thing, and I've this was a decade or more ago, or maybe even more, but I've often wondered whether this is sort of genius or irresponsible, or I've never really managed to get my head around it. But he said something along the lines of, you know, hey, look, the point of this is I'm just the pyrotechnics guy, you know, and what that means is that, you know, the infrastructure was always there, the content was always there, and what I did is I lit the fuse, I ran away with my hands up, and I watched the fireworks with everyone else. You know, and so in a way, you know, to sort of be invited to show the world or a public, you know, who is Ryan Gander, and his decision to say, well, I'm not going to just show you the efforts of my labor and my work and these objects and these rarefied things in the museum. I'm going to show you what's already there. And so actually, by having none of Ryan Gander in there, what's becoming apparent is all the infrastructure and the museology and the, you know, histories of the relations of power between publics and institutions. And, you know, he's sort of exposing something, and he's laying or claiming authorship over that kind of exposure as maybe not even as a work. He said, I don't know if it's an artwork or not. There's none of my artwork in it. But whether or not I did this in a museum makes it art, who cares? I ran away with my hands held up, you know. So I don't know whether it's irresponsible or clever or fascinating. Yeah. But it also seems like in the case of the Rodney the beating video, whether or not it's art is sort of inconsequential. It's a cultural artifact that's deeply important, harrowing, and actually the armature of this armature of like cultural provision of the museum suddenly is being spoken about as much as that art, you know, or in the context of each other.
People are asking questions about why is it here and what is it meant to mean. It's like, why is it?
In a way, that's what you do with your work, but in a more complex sense, you take these they're artifacts, aren't they? You know, whether it's the last words of a dying person or the last speech of a political figure, or the most recent theory of a cultural theory is, you know, you're placing them into another context with something else and then setting it into the world in a certain way. And, you know, it's like, well, that's a Tony Cokes, but it's component parts are context as much as information. And so I think that's really interesting in relation to this idea of authorship and authority over material.
Yeah, I mean, I think that dividing line between traditional notions of authorship and questions of authority are things that, you know, even as a young artist, there were things that I was questioning, at least for myself. You know, at one point, and I've talked about this before in interviews, you know, people, I had this idea that, you know, because there was a tradition of artists attending screenings, that, you know, that it was important to contextualize and describe what was going on in the work, what the intentions were, those kinds of things. But then as the work began to kind of get distributed in festivals and get curated into contexts that I could not physically be there. And because I had kind of come to my media practice through a detour into performance, I kind of had a lot of questions then about whether it was necessary or even helpful, you know, to have me there to contextualize and to authorize certain readings. And maybe it's because of my own relationship to art and contemporary, both contemporary and historical work. It was like, often, you know, I find that when confronted with the intention, I see something else, or I desire something else. And that was a kind of powerful, in a certain way, motivating force. And it was almost like, well, maybe the work will be more productive without me, you know, or without, you know, me there to quote unquote answer questions. It's sort of like people will hopefully figure out or follow their own desires or their, you know, knowledges or lack of knowledge into something that may be productive for them, which may or may not have very much to do with my desires and intentions. And so, yeah, I kind of came to that both not only as a kind of personal realization, but as a kind of part of my methodology. It's almost like I leave it to the viewer as much as possible. I mean, I try to be explicit in certain ways, but, you know, don't want to control the reader or viewer, because in a certain way, my tendency, you know, has been to, you know, say, oh, I'm interested in this, or I'm interested in this in relationship to that, which was not really part of the original context, meaning, or intention. And so, yeah, my tendency has been to find ways to make connections between things and, kind of walk away from the scene. I mean, it's interesting for me, you know, that process. And, you know, I sometimes, you know, say I'm weaving something out of maybe disparate parts, but other people will probably read it radically differently, and I've kind of come to accept that in a certain way. And again, you know, back to your query, you know, I don't know whether that's irresponsible or whether it gives a certain amount of agency and responsibility to the viewer, and a certain knowledge that, you know, I can't be in that other position as much as I can imagine it and project it. You know, people will find their way through the work, and sometimes, you know, associations that are actually there that I just didn't see when I was working on it because I was preoccupied by other things. And that seems to be, you know, part of culture as well. And so, you know, this idea that, I need to be there, or that I can control. You know, I think it may be better, you know, that people do take some agency. And, you know, if it's not what I intended, or they're bringing knowledges that I don't have to the work, in a strange way, that seems totally appropriate. It's almost like to think otherwise would be to kind of indulge in some sort of fiction about, you know, the certainties of knowledge. And, you know, I think especially maybe from my positionalities, it doesn't quite make sense. You know, it's almost like it's fine if someone else wants to believe that, but, you know, it's not what I believe.
I mean, I think this is, I feel I don't want to embarrass you by being so complimentary, but this is what I like about the work so much is
Mhm.
that it speaks to the kind of the highest hopes you want for art. Actually, the idea that these things aren't shut down and closed, but they're given to you. They're a gift to kind of engage and sort of bring what you have to it as well. It's kind of coming together to sort of find the knowledge that's produced in the moment of me seeing what you're doing, and vice versa. And I think this is what's interesting about my criticisms of museum practice in some ways is that because visitors to museums are so frequently kind of imagined in a consumer paradigm, and with regards to engagement dependent funding and also this sort of anxiety museums perhaps have around visitor experience and being given enough, like a consumer
Yeah,
demand
yeah.
to be given something, it sort of, it diminishes the possibility of like understanding problems or troubling relationships as important for a transformative experience. The idea that maybe if I don't understand this, or I bring something that's irrelevant to you but I nonetheless relevant to me, to the work, and that's informed the knowledge that I've produced around this experience, that's transformative.
Yeah.
um, and so
And
the space that you allow for that to happen is incredibly important for the work, is sort of my observation, I think.
yeah, I mean, I think it is a kind of breathing space and a kind of acknowledgement in a certain way that, I've gotten in trouble for saying things like this before, so don't necessarily quote me.
No.
But the idea that, yeah, this is a set of processes, a set of ideas that, anyone could activate, and I hope that they do. We may not agree at the end of the day about what the work is or how it operates, but I'm interested in that much more so than, here's what I meant to say,
Yeah.
here's how I meant to say it. And yes, it's closed, it's certain. I mean, I think in making them, I try to take that, relational exploratory relation to the materials that I'm working with. And yeah, I kind of expect viewers to, I hope viewers can do the same, as opposed to feeling like I have to figure out what he's doing.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, I don't know whether you can figure it out. And I don't know whether it would be particularly useful or relevant to you, even if you did.
Yeah.
That it's not strictly speaking about that. And
Yeah.
I know that it's hard for some people, to kind of take on board because, questions of authorship or responsibility.
Mm.
And it's sort of like, um, and it's like I understand those things in a kind of historical and cultural sense. I do.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like it's just not why I want to do. It's not why I would get up and want to do the work that I do. It's sort of like I have different drives, maybe on a
Yeah.
certain level with regard to that. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Um, just to obviously to try and kind of move things. I've lost pace in terms of where I know you've prepared notes. And do you feel like you've moved through the things you wanted to say in
Um,
these?
Many of them, maybe not all of them. I
Do
mean, in some way or another, in different language, maybe.
Yeah.
It's I would like, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like we were just talking about something similar to this. One of my notes is that I think you had a series of questions about meaning and delivery mechanisms
Yes.
and
Yeah.
those sorts of things. And I just found that a really useful set of questions. And yeah, my response would be it's almost impossible even for me to know all of the source material. You're pretty close to my ideal reader, I feel, but I strongly believe that less than optimal readings may be productive also in ways that I can't fully determine or understand. I mean, I love that ideas and meanings can't be totalized or fully controlled. Now, I know that, meanings are produced, but this idea that somehow I, as an author, are present forever, to those meanings, and that, they're located in me is ridiculous. It's sort of like they're, as much effects of my encounter with different kinds of materials and histories and, my own desires and expectations for what the work should be. Someone else must, kind of necessarily approach those things differently. And I'd like to activate those possibilities as opposed to, close them down and say that they're inherent in me. It's sort of like maybe that's part of the reason why I work so heavily with quotation, because I know that it's a kind of co-production, a co-making. It's not, like I know what you're going to think when you're, or what your experience is going to be. All I can do, is say in traditional exhibition context, people ask why, I might insist upon seating. It's sort of like, hey, I want to encourage people to spend the quality and quantity of time that they can. And if they feel a slippage or loss because they were not able to attend to all of the material or attend equally well to all the material, that may be true, but this idea that I need to deliver in a certain time, or that people need to move through the space in a kind of quantifiable way, it's not my, it's sort of like, in fact, I'm kind of actively resistant. It's sort of like, you can't quantify it. You could, and if people have feelings of loss or whatever in relationship to the work, I think on a certain level, I'm not sure there's much I can do about it. In terms of contextual information or, whatever, I'm happy to supply it. But again, it's sort of like, I wonder if it's necessary. People will, make of and use the material in ways that probably, for good or ill, I can't imagine. And I like it that way, because maybe that's the address that I take to the materials that I use, is that I'm supplying, frameworks and knowledges that may not be, intended or authoritative. But yeah, it's sort of like, I know people have very strong feelings about these matters.
Yeah. No, but I love it. I mean, just a note on kind of how I came to the work was I wanted to. I didn't read anything that Tony Tremlett had written. I was given the films, and I thought, well, I'm just going to, first off, at least, I'm just going to watch them, and that's how I did it. So in many cases, I recognized the source material. I guessed what it was, particularly like the music, but also thought, well, I've read that before, I've heard that before, and then, but the one, I think I mentioned it in a question, the one that strangely stumped me was the Elijah McCain and Manic Street Preachers. So I was like, I don't know. I didn't even know it was Manic Street Preachers because it's a different singer, isn't it, singing? So, so I didn't know the song at all. But I kind of, when I went through my second viewing and I located and Googled the sources and pieced it together, I kind of realized, I thought, well, hang on, okay, so it troubled me. I was like, what is the relationship then between, Elijah McCain and Manic Street Preachers? And I know there's not I'm not being able to unlock a key, a door with a key or anything, but just from my own curiosity, I was trying to piece it together. And suddenly I just thought, well, I'm just going to take a completely cold reading of it. Here's a white band talking about ideas of complicity and, their own guilt and things, and for the first time in the sequence, you've got this really, really visceral, painful kind of, depiction of the first-hand account of the kind of violence that's been being talked about through the whole thing, and I just thought that was suddenly really interesting. So, like you've been saying, that what's happened for me, and it's my subjectivity, is that I've equated kind of white guilt and complicity with an act of horrendous violence, and that's become totally shored up in my reading, and that might not be in anyone else's, and it's because of my lack of knowledge of the source material more than my knowledge of it. So I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, because you don't know. Yeah, that's the thing. I tell people, it's good if you know the references, but in some ways it may constitute a problem. Because it's a kind of relation. It's speculative in a certain way. But yeah, that's kind of how it worked for me too. Sort of like, I was thinking, this is a very, very powerful text. I could add nothing to it and it would still maybe function that way. But I thought, if there was something I could do to kind of intensify it, in a kind of not, it's sort of like, no, the voice of the song is not the same as the voice of the text, and it's sort of like, can you build, a kind of relationship maybe between, the observation and the point of view in the song lyric and what's being said. And even if you don't, I think even if you don't know what the source is of either piece, putting them together produces, a kind of third or fourth, possibility.
I mean, for me, it's the one that tugged the hardest of all. I just, it did me in.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I will tell you, when I first encountered that text, I had the same
yeah,
feeling. It was sort of like, what can I do with this even?
yeah,
I can't even process it.
yeah,
There's something about the fragmentation, the the kind of like relationships that one wants to make between the individuals, statements. It's almost like, this is something really, really bad, even though it's not super descriptive or explicit. It's something, situational, like the first line being, I can't breathe. I thought, well,
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
people will recognize this,
yeah,
but will they then follow,
yeah,
what the rest of the material is?
yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, the things, are just, but I thought, is there something to complicate this, or to give a kind of perspective or set of perspectives on it? And yeah, I think the lyric kind of does this. um yeah, it's some people have described it as a weird kind of, I don't know, middle class, feeling of impotence or
Yeah,
complicity with
yeah.
something. And they don't really even say exactly what it is.
No,
Just that, guilty like others, you
yeah,
know, um, of no consequence. And it's sort of like, yeah, and something really, really ugly is unfolding, and you still can't, wake yourself up enough to
yeah,
intervene in it, which is the thing about a lot of these narratives. It's not just one person acting. There are people standing around watching.
no, yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's like, well, this may be wrong, but I can't get into it, with my, colleague here.
yeah.
And that's weird. It's just really, really, really weird.
It,
Um,
it's surreal and bizarre, but it speaks to kind of how people are kind of co-opted, or not co-opted, but like capitulate to the structures, that are like, their job, their employment, their kind of the hierarchies within their own social systems, or their employers, kind of, something wrong is happening here. But what would be more wrong for you personally would be to intervene, because then you jeopardize or put at stake something that you've earned, and that's so fucked up.
yeah,
Um, so
it's
yeah,
kind of crazy, and it's weird. Like this is something I've been thinking about, probably through a theoretical angle. It's almost like, why is it that now it seems that explicit forms of violence recorded, can continue to occur?
yeah,
It's almost like old definitions of, if someone sees this, I may be, implicated,
yeah,
or I may even, this may actually serve as evidence against me. And now it's almost like, no, I'm going to do this. And when this is over, you can circulate the video as much as you want, but this thing is kind of done.
yeah.
It's kind of a different level. It's sort of like, you think that the body cams are going to, curb something. It's almost like, it's too crazy. It's too
It goes
crazy
back
for
to
the
that kind of Trumpian magical.
Yeah.
I don't know how it works. I mean, in fact, this is an anecdotal thing, but I watched a film recently, which was like a French kind of low budget kind of film. I can't remember what it's called or who it was by. Sorry. But essentially, it was like a dystopia, a near future dystopia, where kind of corporations were governing. There were no governments. It was all privatized corporations governing society, and blah blah blah. And there were these huge inequities and huge inequalities, and people living impoverished in the streets and blah, and totally oppressed. Anyway, what happened is, the upshot of this film is that it was made about 3 years ago. The upshot was, someone had hacked into the mainframe, or whatever, and revealed that the government had inadvertently kind of presided over the death of 2,000 innocent civilians, and there was uproar, and that brought about the radical upsurge, and kind of brought down the corporation and the government, and the world changed for the better, because 2,000 people died at the hands of a corporate government. And I was thinking, 2,000? 2,000
Yeah.
are dying a day. No one cares. Everyone still supports Trump and Boris Johnson. Like, it just seems so
Yeah.
wildly old-fashioned that 2,000
Mm.
innocent deaths would sort of cause a revolution. It's like, we've got 100,000 deaths in the UK, and everyone's still voting
Yeah.
for Boris Johnson.
Yeah. We've got 400,000 here and over 2,000 a day. Yeah, it's crazy.
And it's like, yeah, so
yeah.
this idea that only 3-4 years ago, a writer could say, listen, if your population only found out that, the government could willingly preside over the deaths of 2,000 people, there'd be uproar. No, they won't.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. Okay, so I have if you're happy, I've got like a final kind of question in a way.
Sure. I can't send you my notes. They're kind of, misaligned, but they actually follow the chronology of the text, but I haven't really pointed, to specific passages in some cases.
Sure. Okay. Did you say you're able to send me the notes? Or?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Yeah. I suppose one note I made just prior to our interview, prior to this conversation, was I had another thought about the final text and it not using the coded language, and I wonder if I'm wondering whether to sort of read my garbled notes here, if that's all right.
Go right ahead.
Yeah. So my final question is sort of, is this coded speech a form of resistance? I always liked poetry for this reason, as a kind of a political methodology, poetry as a politics, if you like, where words are able to emancipate themselves from useful function. But words are also dependent on context. So in the context of poetry, of course, they're useful, but it's about the, information delivery and opens up other space for the reception of meaning made in the conditions of the encounter too. So this is leading to a question, I promise.
Don't worry.
So, I just scribbled these just before I called you. Placing these myriad demands on viewers. Actually, I'm going to skip this. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So in light of that, I wondered actually, because the 4 films move from this kind of almost individual, libertarian, if you like, desire to sort of say, no, we must stand up against oppression. It's our individual responsibility to harness anger and do the right thing for ourselves. And then the second one talks about, kind of solidarity and non-violence and democratic process. The third one, we see sort of firsthand, the brutal effects of these kind of oppressions and an idea of complicity with them. And these are all kind of very, very open spaces for debate and discussion. They move through these particular sequences. But for me, the last one with Judith Butler and the twisted dystopic kind of Joy Division sound almost feels like if these things were questions or kind of strange evidences put before like a court or a jury in Piccadilly Circus, it's like the final one is a verdict. And so, the verdict comes through and it's like, this is not only an individual struggle. This is not only about democratic process. This is not only about people of color and their pain and their suffering. This is about governments working against you through choice because they're privileging profits over people, and they're doing this. And actually, this has to be clear. It has to be didactic. It has to be spelled out because it's real. And there's a certain kind of informational quality about Judith Butler's text, which perhaps doesn't need to be codified or made poetic. It's
I actually did, a coded version of it, and I felt I actually showed it to a few people who were not involved in my, production process, and I kind of got the same reaction, that there was something that was lost by not being able to even determine what the words were. It was just too fragmented in a way to be useful.
Yeah.
And I found that as a kind of, and it was something that I kind of sensed. It was the last one that I did. And the reason it was the last one was because I wasn't quite sure what would be legible.
Yeah.
And, of course, when actually doing it and then showing it to a few people, I did get the impression that it was like, there are so many, if you will, undecidabilities that, people didn't know what it was exactly they were looking at. And there was a part of me that said, well, that might be an interesting ending, for this series, where you think, you've learned something maybe about my methodology and my coding system, but then you get to something that you really don't understand and that you can't enter into. But I thought that maybe it would be, kind of better as a sequence, as you describe it, to sort of say, these are things that are happening which, you know, you can take a certain amount of time, but you think you can decode them. But here's something that we maybe need to consider, just, you know, because it is describing a kind of complex and current situation, that, you know, I think it would be, again, a kind of disservice to the text and its potential for meaning and resonance to kind of say, oh, it's poetry, you know, it's work on language, it's formal in that way. I was really kind of struck by a lot of the things that actually you had to say about the work in general, and it was really sort of productive for me in terms of my own thinking, because, you know, sometimes I set things up and then I'm trying to execute them.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll have conversations with people about, well, is this effective, or how do you read this? But I hadn't had actually anyone actually go through the entire sort of set and try to think through and maybe get me to think through what it is that I was trying to activate and why I made certain decisions and not others. But yeah, I would kind of agree that it was almost like we need to now take a look at, you know, a kind of set of systemic relations and admit the possibility that as maybe productive in terms of readerliness and kind of an opening to the imagination, we might also want to look at this in a kind of more didactic register and try to understand it and its effects, because they are quite complex. And, you know, I think it's easy to, and you know, I think part of what we were discussing, I think when we started, you know, was that people seem to be very confused about what's going on, you know, here today. And I think that's a text, even if you deny or disagree with its content. And I think that's maybe a little bit of an issue. I think some people were drawn towards the coding because maybe it allowed them to suspend the content of the text.
That's interesting.
And it was almost like, maybe I don't want to do that.
Yes.
Today. Maybe later in another context I might, but not here, not right now. And so maybe there is a kind of, if you will, relational or contextual, you know, operation that's part of, my thinking as I worked on it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think 2 points there are really interesting that I hadn't considered. I mean, one is that, you know, the Judith Butler's articulation of the current situation, which is intensely complex, it is also current, you know, so rather than it being an artifact, it's kind of it's an ongoing, it's speaking to an immediate discourse of the situation. So to kind of have it further sort of, you know, complicated would be
complicated.
But also, I really liked your point that, you know, codifying the prior pieces, it allows viewers the space to kind of negotiate with themselves what they feel in relation to it. Whereas this one you may disagree, but it's 100% legible. You know, you can have this point of view and you can disagree with it, but you can't refute it because you don't understand it. You know, you know, I'm always telling my students to do this. You know, you can argue what you like, but you have to take me along with you so that I can, you know, I can disagree with you, but on the ground of your argument, not by refuting your argument, but by just disagreeing with it. I can disagree with you, but take me along so I can see the veracity of it. You know, it's and I think this is what is important about leaving Judith Butler's as it is it's a contemporary, immediate discourse that's ongoing, and the legibility of her position is clear, irrefutable, whether you disagree with it or agree with it or not. And I think that's really important. Yeah. Amazing.
Thank you, Lynton. It was,
no, thank you. I mean, it's been amazing just spending this much time with the work and being able to write about it and ask. It was daunting to, you know, there's so much to ask of the work, and, you know, I'm such a big fan of your work anyway. So it was kind of daunting, but it was a total pleasure to do it. And I hope the spirit in which I did it came across as sort of respectful and
yes, absolutely.
But,
in fact, I scanned your text when it came in and I said, oh, but then I sat down and read it.
Okay.
It was like, okay, yeah, I have many responses, and maybe that was part of what the was that, like, oh man, when can I, you know, where do I start, you know?
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I mean, my plan was to actually ask
Sorry
you
at all. I mean,
questions.
I appreciate the generosity of the gesture, you know, because some people I think would have felt like, oh, I have to have 7 questions.
Yeah,
And, you know, it's sort of like, no, it's sort of like, I mean, it was really useful to sort of see your thinking process
yeah,
as you sort of went through the work. And, you know, I appreciate that.
yeah,
Because that doesn't always happen. You know, sometimes it's like, I've got questions and hopefully you'll have answers, and that's
yeah,
kind of it. Yeah.
yeah. And I had planned to just send you the questions, but I thought actually the way I'm writing and responding to this is so much informing the way or why I'm asking these questions. I thought
Yeah,
to come in to provoke a discussion, and but thank you so much for kind of having this conversation with me. And
you're very welcome.
yeah,
It was a pleasure.
Circa offers a very important platform.
It's really just asking us to pause in this moment.
Art can be a form of disruption when it appears on such a exposed place as the Piccadilly advertising screen. Hi, it's Hans.
My wish would really be that we could find it in our mind and hearts to really work as one people.
Public art right now can only be important if it supports your community.
See Your Name in Lights is our fundraising initiative to challenge this model of only having kind of, rich 1% funding and supporting the arts.